You're listening to Errol Parker and Clancy Overall, editors of the Betoota Advocate, on Desert Rock FM. Welcome back to Betoota Talks. You're joined by myself, Clancy Overall, and of course, Errol Parker, editor and editor-at-large of the Betoota Advocate. This week is the second of our new series, pre-election podcasts. The election will be called any time now. In fact, we're recording this at the back end of the week, and if it gets called on the Friday, it's already been called. But I'm not sure of that, and I'm not going to ask today's guest to speculate on that. Thank you for joining us today, Bridget Archer, the member for Bass.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Bridget, we'll point out to the listeners that we reached out to you online, saying,
"Yep, on X,
on the platform known as X, because we really wanted to speak to you. And there's a list of politicians and people in and around federal politics that we want to speak to before the election. You were one that we've wanted to speak to for a while. I think the reason for that is, as Queenslanders, there's this kindred spirit we have with Tasmanians. Very different landscapes, very different places, but
long forgotten people.
Yeah, we were kind of overlooked quite a lot. And people speak their mind in both Queensland and Tasmania. You have a bit of a reputation for doing your own thing, despite being part of a major party. Did you envision that when you first joined the Liberal Party? Did you envision that? Okay, I'm going to have to cross the floor quite a lot in this kind of institution that I'm now part of?
No, probably not. I think actually anybody who has probably ever known me over my life would think this was an unlikely career path for me in any event. But, I wouldn't have been renowned when I was younger for being sort of outspoken or whatever. But I got involved in local government for a few years, for about a decade before I came to the federal parliament. And, so I guess that experience kind of encouraged me, I guess, to sort of speak up for my community. And, if you're going to do this, whether it's at local government level or any level, that you've got to be prepared to back yourself in, to have some principles and be prepared to stand on them. Like I frequently say, if you don't have a hill that you're prepared to die on, you should be doing something else. But also, it's a consensus model, so you can't die on every hill either.
Well, Robert Menzies founded the Liberal Party as a progressive force championing the individual rights and their right to enterprise, while, people like John Howard have said, it emphasised broad social cohesion in a coalition, while Paul Keating said it's a party of convenience. What originally drew you to the Liberal Party?
Yeah, I'm probably most persuaded by by those words of Menzies. I think a lot of people would say that. And you opened the podcast by talking about those synergies between Tassie and Queensland and feeling a bit forgotten. And for me, that's what's drawn me to the party. A party of aspiration, if you like, a party that sort of encourages free enterprise. But also, as John Howard pointed out, I think social cohesion is, of course, important as well. But I think at its best, the party can bring together people of diverse views and opinions, but also sort of united by some common values. And that's important, I think, in the country, because that's what happens in the country. People have got diverse views and opinions, and we're not homogenous. And I actually think that disagreement is a good thing. That's how we get change. That's how we get progress. If everyone just kind of follows along and no one says, do you think that's a good idea? Or how about we try this? Or are you barking mad? Nothing is going to change. Do you know what I mean? So I think disagreement is a good thing, but I think it's become a little bit harder to manage that politically over time, because we've come probably with all the sort of changing of prime ministers and what have you that we saw, we've had a more nervousness about discipline and unity being seen as something really important. And it is important, but it doesn't mean that you don't have divergent views and you shouldn't be able to express them.
You would have probably been in and around local government at a time before social media. Would that be correct?
There was social media, but nothing like now, probably.
Because we see it whether we're dealing with agribusiness, you know, the different bodies that we, democratic bodies that the Betoota Advocate liaise with. They could be anything, you know, they could be the press club, they could be the whatever, they could be political parties. Something has changed in the last 10 years, and I think it speaks to the amount of prime ministers we had, both Labor and Liberal, the spills, the kind of nervousness and the jumpiness and the trigger happiness, the knee jerking, kind of comes from this culture that we can't quite understand as, you know, human beings looking into phones all the time. Because once upon a time, you'd have your issue with the body, with the AGM, with the GM, with the leader, and you'd wait till an AGM to discuss it, or you'd wait till your weekly meeting to discuss it. But now people are in a position where they can fire off an email at 11 o'clock at night after a bottle of red, and things blow up well before the meeting where you're meant to discuss these things rationally. Have you found that in your time in federal politics?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that it's almost that perfect storm of things where it's a bit depersonalising. Like if you've got to kind of front up and have a conversation with a person, that's probably going to be different than if you are, behind a screen or whatever. There's an immediacy to social media and digital conversation, like you say, where you maybe don't have a chance to take the temperature down sometimes or think about what you're going to say, and away you go. I think that's true right across society, and I think it's something that we're grappling with in all parts of our communities, and it's having like lots of effects. I think we're growing, having a growing awareness of it now too, and people are maybe trying to take steps to deal with that. But yeah, definitely, I think it's changed the political landscape.
You one thing that we try and, in this podcast, we've got a lot of listeners who aren't that across politics, and this is why we enjoy doing this leading into a federal election, speaking with different people from different parties and different moving parts of the machine. But one thing that I guess people don't realise is that there's a lot of people down there. There's a lot of people in Canberra. There's a lot of people in your party. I mean, there'd be people down there in your party elected either into the Senate or the lower house that you haven't met before. Would you agree that that's it's a much bigger world than people think?
Yeah, it's a pretty big environment. I don't reckon there's any people certainly on my own side that I haven't met.
Sorry, the party's a bit smaller nowadays.
And certainly, like I sit in the House of Representatives, and I would say I've met and talked to every member of the House of Representatives, but we don't always cross paths, obviously, with the Senate, because they're sitting generally, at the same time as we are, the other side of the building, doing sort of different things. So, there's certainly the dark arts of the Senate is more of a mystery to me.
Where I was going with that is when you all of a sudden pop your head up, as you have done, as a Liberal MP who speaks out, who crosses the floor, what's that feeling like all of a sudden knowing that you are a household name, not just in Canberra, but amongst all of the Liberal Party branch rooms and state presidents across Australia? What was that like for you?
I think initially it's certainly it's uncomfortable. I think it's reasonable to say that human beings, in my opinion, pretty, we tend to be, as a collective, pretty tribal at the best of times. And that's the same in political parties and politics and whatever. Nobody wants people to not like them or, to make other people unhappy or whatever. So I guess it can be uncomfortable. But I think that goes back to that point too, that what are we sent here to do? What is the point? And I was very clear about that when I was first elected, and I've said it many times since that, it's my intention to be a genuine, authentic representative from my community, because that's what I think this should look like. We should come from the 151 at the moment electorates across the country as a representative of those people, and to bring their issues and their concerns here to Canberra. And I don't believe it should work the other way around, that we're taking Canberra's views back to our communities. So I think I have to go back to why you're here, to overcome that, if you like. And if I can go back to my community and say, look, I've tried to consider all these legislation in your best interests and to genuinely represent you, I think then if I do a good job of that, I can say to the party, as a secondary consideration, if you like, well, then I'm a good representative for you, because I've done what my community wants me to do. And I think all too often now, and I don't think it's always been this way, but again, I think it goes to that unity sort of issue that people are afraid to do that because they don't want to seem to be disunified or not disciplined. But actually, if you can't speak to your electorate and you can't do a good job representing them, you don't get to come and represent your party.
Yeah.
I just want to touch on briefly how the factions work, because every party has a faction where, you've got your, dyed-in-the-wool communists like the Prime Minister and his side of the Labor Party. You've got, the champagne socialists there like the Richard Marles from Geelong. You've got, the Melbourne part of the Greens, ex-lawyers, very smart, very intelligent people. And then you've got, of course, our Queensland Greens who are a bit more in touch with reality and the social issues plaguing people in South Brisbane and indeed West Brisbane. How does it look like in the Liberal Party? I mean, you've obviously got your super liberals that go to church on Sundays. You've got your half in, half out ones, and you've got your ones who are true to sort of Menzies' word. How do you guys interact? Like, is there like one big cafeteria? Do you each have like a clubhouse? Do you, how do you do business?
Group chats?
Yeah, there probably is some group chats. Look, I think as you're right. I mean, and I think that's true across, again, outside of politics and just in terms of the way that people interact with each other. They tend to coalesce around people who are like-minded. I think in the Labor Party, I think that's a more formalised position. I think people are sort of formally, factionally aligned. It doesn't so much happen that way over our side, although, and I never really thought about it until I came to Canberra because, I just Tasmanian Liberals, I'd been around the Tasmanian Liberals for a while and they'd pre-selected me and they seemed to be pretty like-minded people. And so that was my understanding. And I come here and I see that you've got, as you pointed out, people are representing different constituencies and, they've got those different value sets or whatever. I think our party has been able to, generally people can come together and coexist in that way, but they will tend to organise, like any group does, around like-minded sort of issues and like-minded colleagues. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think the issue more is that you'll get put in a faction. You'll sort of be identified as one faction or another, whether you like it or not. Like, yeah. I wouldn't necessarily identify myself as a particular anything, but that's that's something that other people probably do. But I think there's a unite, there's those overarching values, I think, that exist in political parties, for example, that people are like, yeah, I'm more akin to that value set than I am to that one between the parties rather than within them, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, I want to kind of talk to you about the last couple of years, not actually the last couple of years, the last term of Parliament where, from an outsider looking in, and I hope I'm not kind of explaining how you were feeling, but from an outsider looking in, it did look like you were under siege from your own party. That was the Morrison era. I'm sure there were a lot of people that felt the same way as you, but you obviously, as we said before, were, national news at certain moments. How did you endure that? Parties changed a lot too, obviously, so we don't need to talk about that era as though those issues are still there. How did you endure that, and what convinced you to stay? I mean, because, we know Tasmanians, they're like Queenslanders. You could have gone independent and you could have just become the Jackie Lambie of the lower house, just like Bob Catter left the Nationals and became an independent himself. And as we see, every second election, someone does it. What convinced you to stay?
Look, I think that there hasn't really ever been too much doubt in my mind about staying so much. It would be, it would be a complete fabrication to say that hasn't been some of the most challenging experiences that I've had. And it's really deeply uncomfortable. And I think anyone that has ever sort of, I guess, had to exercise their principles on something when other people in that setting don't share those views will understand that feeling. Like, it's very confronting. It's very uncomfortable. Sometimes people get very angry with you, and that's tough. And I think it's fair to say that I have had, without being too woo-woo, had a lot. I've had to have a lot of personal growth in that time to just to hang in, and I guess to keep going and to keep pushing through that. But I do that because I think it's really important. And when we talk about political parties, I think it goes to the question you asked me before about what does the party look like or who constructs it. It's really easy for us to look at that as who sits here in elected positions in Canberra. And I think it's easy to forget that political parties are and always have been made up of just ordinary people in our communities, grassroots members. And in the same way as, volunteers might swing in behind particular independents or whatever, that's exactly what happens in political parties. You get people who are, if it works well, people who are united by sort of common general values, wanting to get behind their parties and candidates and be those parties and candidates, importantly. Some of that's fractured a bit, I think, over recent years. And we've seen people say, well, I don't see myself necessarily represented in this space, so I'm going to go over there. I'm going to become an independent. That's a valid choice. I'm not going to diss anybody that does that. But for me, it's about two other things. One, I believe in parties of government. This is a system that we have. You need to have a government and a credible alternative government, and independents are an important part of that, but they're not a government, to be very clear. But I think it is also about what you want a party to look like. If you want a party, whether it's the Liberal Party, the Labor Party or the Greens, if you sit back and say, I wish that party was better because my values broadly align with them, and I wish that party was better, you are not going to make that party any better if you walk away. Yeah. You're going to make that party better if you stay and you bring all of your friends. That would be the argument that I would make. I'd like to bring in a few more friends. I haven't got probably as far down that road as I would like. But certainly I think, and you don't. I think this goes to values for me as well too. Like, when things get hard, dig in a bit harder. Don't walk away, stand your digs, have the fight and, and stand by your principles. And that's what I try to do. And, I would love to to have more like-minded colleagues join my party and support some of the things that I'm interested in, because then I'll get a little bit more of what I want, and my community will get a little bit more of what they want in that discussion. But I just don't think when things get hard, and particularly I think when, I've had a bit of bark knocked off on the way through, it's got to mean something too, and make it worthwhile. So dig in and keep going, I say.
What does the typical Liberal voter look like in Bass? I mean, like, what was the message from the electorate last time you went to an election?
Well, I think this is where Bass is a kind of an interesting seat, and historically always has been, because, it's maybe one of those seats where the demographics are harder to define, and you've got some sort of, Liberal members and Liberal, leaning people, and some Labor members and some Labor leaning sort of voters. And then there's a lot of swing voters, I think, basically in Bass as well. So that's probably explained why it has been over time the ejector seat of Australian politics. But in terms of, like, if your question goes to what does a Liberal Party member look like in Bass, then, I mean, they've pre-selected me 4 times now. So I think it's fair to say that they, are like-minded to some of the views, or many or most of the views that I've expressed over time.
Now, the Liberal Party is making a clear play at the working class seats of Melbourne and Sydney. There's a whole lot of different fault lines opening up this electorate. Last election was pretty easy. It was a referendum on your former boss, your former leader, Scott Morrison. Nowadays, it's cost of living. Now we're talking about, standard of living. And you seem to be able to communicate the concerns and the worries and anxieties of the working class quite accurately. Where do you think your party, and indeed Parliament in general, needs to be looking? And I ask this because one of the first times, or maybe the first time you crossed the floor, was to you're crossing the floor against the cashless debit cards for welfare recipients, which is something that only someone who could really know that life would understand. It's a very hot button issue. It's an easy thing for a kind of well-heeled politician to say that, people on welfare should only be buying certain things, and we can make sure they only buy those certain things. But as you argued, it actually implies that those people, don't have any agency over what they do. And, and it actually does make their life harder, was what you argued. Where do you think the party should be going? And has there been progress made, as you said before, bringing a bit of Bridget Archer into the Liberal Party? Has there been progress made in the way, the Liberal Party coalition views poor people or treats them?
Yeah, and I think there's quite a few aspects to that, and that sort of question. In some ways, I think there's a misconception in a way that there's a kind of Liberal Party's some kind of party of the elites as well. I think that's, and that is not, as you opened with, like, that is not the where the Liberal Party began, and it's not historically where its roots have been, and even in that sort of social safety net sort of area. Menzies himself was very clear on, support for vulnerable people and whatever as well, and social safety nets. I personally, am a kind of, working class girl. I've worked before I became involved in local government, and that's subsequent to meeting my husband now. Most of my work was in casual and insecure work. I've worked in hospitality for many, many years, in casual employment. I've been a single parent, and I think a whole other range of sort of just normal lived experience that people have that sort of brings that perspective to Parliament. And I think we're seeing more people from more diverse walks of life in our Parliament, which I think is a really good thing, because you get right across the political spectrum, because I think you get that greater understanding of representing your constituents, which again is what it's all about. I think there's just been some shifts, and there always is these kind of shifts over time, where at the end of the day, it all comes back to these issues. You know, how are people living in their communities? What is the challenge that people are facing in their day-to-day lives? And, you know, as much as there's a tendency, particularly amongst, some of the, chattering classes that we move in from time to time, they're not often the things that most people are talking about. Like if you go out and knock on a door, or you go and talk to someone at a shopping centre, those themes remain pretty consistent over time. How am I going to keep a roof over my head? How do I feed my family? How am I educating my family? Can I get access to healthcare? Can I drive on the roads or walk on the footpaths that I need to? All of those sorts of things, they remain consistent over time. But I think there's been a tendency, particularly in recent years, to kind of certainly what people often are hearing then and hearing from this government has been other things that are not front of mind for them, more big picture ideas. All of those things are great and valid and worthwhile. But I think that when people are doing it tough, much of that is going to fall away, and they're going to say, well, hang on a minute, like I have to turn up to the food bank now because I have to prioritise keeping the rent paid so I can have somewhere to live. And so a lot of other things fall away then, I think, in their consciousness. So, and that should be the most important thing we do. That should be the most important considerations we have. So I think it's about connection with that. What is actually impacting on people's lives?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on quickly that you have the privilege of being one of the few members that have an island in their electorate. I mean, you've got
my electorate is on an island.
Yeah, no, but an island. Well, an island has an island on it. You've got the latent hippie up in the tip, Warren Ench. He's got a few. You've got the member for Bean, who's David Smith. I think he's got Norfolk Island. Tanya Plibersek's got Lord Howe Island.
Doesn't Albo have one?
Albo's got Goat Island.
Goat Island, a little quarantine centre.
And you have Flinders Island.
I do have Flinders Island, which is an amazing place. And it would be remiss of me not to mention, though, that as well as Flinders Island, there are many, many, many islands in the Furneaux group around Flinders Island as well, which are all also part of the electorate of Bass, some more populated than others. But Flinders Island's an amazing place with very unique needs, I guess, being an island, off an island state. And it's a real privilege to represent them and to represent the communities there. I try to get over there pretty frequently, and it's an amazing place.
I can imagine that life's pretty slow on Flinders Island, just for it's probably not too dissimilar to life here in the middle of the Simpson Desert. Can you paint a picture for our listeners, especially the ones listening locally? What is life like on Flinders Island?
Yeah, I think that anybody that has ever been to an island, will recognise that idea of island time, and Flinders Island is no different to that. It is a relaxed environment. It's a really close-knit community. And everybody knows each other. And I love it when I go there, sort of fly in to the airport, and you might go down the street in Whitemark and talk to someone at the bakery, and then you drive down to the other end of the island to Lady Barron. And before you've got down there, they know that you're there and they know what you've said to the people at the other end of the island. It's, great community, and it's very beautiful. Like it's I don't think you realise it seems like not too far away. You can fly there in 25 minutes from, Tasmania, but when you get there, it feels remote as well, and it is remote, and people have to stick together and be very strong communities because everything's just a little bit harder there to do and access and to exist.
Yeah, I have heard on good authority that that people from Flinders Island hate people from King Island. Do you know if that's true?
I don't think that's true. No, I think they're.
I thought there was a bit
I
of
think
healthy
they're working
rivalry
together a little bit more in recent years as well because they recognise that they have, whilst they've got unique challenges, they also have some things that they share, and it's been good to see some collaboration, which I think then some sharing of resources and stuff, which is really, really useful. But Tasmania is also somewhat not renowned for its existing parochialism anyway. So it's a feature of Tasmania.
Yes, had a great night out a couple of years ago in Launceston, and I did find it to be a very unique place. Pubs with bands playing on every corner, very lively. The monkeys in the park. Can we explore that, please, Bridget Archer?
Well, the monkeys are facing a little bit of trouble ahead because they've been, they were a gift many years ago in the city park, but we can't bring any more monkeys in to supplement that population, and so they're experiencing quite a lot of inbreeding, and that is not the time for any Tasmanian jokes.
No.
But the local Launceston City Council has determined that for the welfare of that population and whatever going forward, that they will be unfortunately having to sterilise all of the monkeys in the city park so that they will eventually die out and no longer.
So maybe this is something you can take to the agricultural minister. Surely can we get more monkeys in so they either stop inbreeding or they don't have to be gently kind of removed as a landmark?
It's sad for the monkeys, and the monkeys are quite iconic to Launceston. So I think they'll continue to exist. They live for a long time, which is good news for the monkeys, and so they'll be there for a good while to come yet. But they will, slowly as their numbers die out, they will slowly dwindle over time, unfortunately.
Yes, I can imagine that there'll be a countdown on the front page of the Examiner for years to come, won't there?
Well, we might have to have a think about what we might be able to replace the city park monkeys with in the city park.
Yeah, they were Japanese, weren't they? They were a Japanese circus gift.
Yes, yes, that's right. Yeah. From a sister city, I believe.
I want to talk to you now. We've obviously asked you a lot of questions about the trials and tribulations of simply being in the Liberal Party. Let's talk about your opposition, because that's obviously where you're taking the fight to. I mean, you've also explained that you're very much a local member in the sense that local issues, local, which is what I guess local constituents want. But you've also got to win an election if you want change, right? And to win an election, I guess you need to remove Labor from power. So what are your issues with Labor? What would you argue Labor are doing wrong?
Well, I think I've tried to demonstrate that I'm a pretty fair-minded person and, I have constructively worked across political lines. And I think that's actually really important as a local member. And because, you need a local member that's going to be effective whether they are a member of the government or not. And I've really pride myself on the fact that because I have been collaborative and I've built relationships, that I have been able to achieve those things even from opposition. And I have been able to walk in, to government ministers' offices or talk to them about, things that are important and people that are important in my electorate. So I think that is an important first point, that your local representation matters regardless of what the colour of the government is. They need to be able to be effective regardless. So I think that is important. But I think like many people, the government made some pretty big promises and statements coming in. And they said things like, no one would be held back, no one would be left behind. And I think those are the particular couple of statements that jar me the most when I look to my local community, is that people are being held back and have been left behind. And it's not to say, I think the government and governments will always say, oh, look, we've done all of these things. Like, we've tried to bring cost of living measures and we've done this and we've done that. And a good example in my community is the rollout of the government's urgent care clinics. Now, I don't have a problem with urgent care. I think it's great. And in the urgent care clinic in my electorate, they've seen a lot of patients. And the government's saying, well, that's a great thing. And it is a good thing at one level that people have got access to see a doctor under those circumstances and they're not presenting to the emergency department for those things. However, like, the number of people that are presenting to that clinic, that the government's own numbers show that that's not just those emergencies, if you like, that are being turned away from the hospital. It's seeing people who can't otherwise see any other doctor. So it's a double-edged sword, if you know what I mean. Like, it's great that people can access that urgent care clinic, and I think well done to the government for doing that. But we can't sort of let it be an excuse, a substitute for quality access to primary care. And, we've seen at the same time as these urgent care clinics have opened, we've seen a kind of contraction then of GP services in communities and in rural and remote communities in Tasmania and elsewhere in the country. So I think that's a good example of where, the spin is not necessarily the kind of whole of the story or the lived experience on the ground. Housing's another one that's, particularly exercises me. And I, as we've talked earlier, burnt a bit of personal political capital on supporting the government's housing bill. And I said at the time that I couldn't go back to my community and say, with the crisis that I see in housing there every day, that I couldn't go back to my community and say, oh, look, the government's proposed something that might help and I'm not going to give them the chance to do that, but I am going to hold them to account as to whether it does what they say it's going to do. And we're still seeing people really held back in that regard. Like, my office dealing with people every day that are sleeping rough, kids living in cars and things like that, which just more needs to be done. So, I think I am a person who has shown that I will work with the government. I'll collaborate with them. I'm trying to get outcomes. But it is also my job to hold them to account and say, you haven't done enough. What you've done isn't working. And you need to do more. So I think, that's the point that I'm making. And I think that's the case that I'm making for my own re-election, is that that's what I'll do and what I have done, and I'll do that whatever colour the government is.
I think you must have a much harder job than most people in Parliament, in the sense that you are standing by your own values that you've carried with you into politics. As you said before, you kind of burn capital within the party by voting for, solutions, or at least, perceived solutions. And you've also got a party that don't really have any policies heading into a 2025 federal election. Do you often feel like you're expected to do not much other than vote no?
I never feel that myself. What we do here really matters. It makes a difference in people's lives, and it means something. And for me to come here, it's a great privilege. We talk about it. It is a great privilege to be elected to be a member of Parliament. We don't talk nearly enough about the responsibility that comes with that. Like, that privilege comes with a responsibility, and to me, that's a responsibility to my community. But I think it also bears mentioning, like with anyone else, that we don't do these sort of things alone. And it comes at a whole lot of other costs. Like, I've got 5 kids. I'm away from my kids half of the time. They make sacrifices and choices and whatever for me to do what I'm doing. And I feel an obligation to them, both personally as their parent, but also to their generation as well, that if we're coming here with the responsibility to do things, to take action, to improve people's lives, to leave a better place for the next generation and whatever, that's no game to me. And I think, as uncomfortable as sometimes it has been, when I have, and that's that growth, I suppose, that I've talked about, and you get to the point where you say, well, if I can't come here and do that and stay solid to that, I should do something else.
Now, in the roller coaster that has been the last couple of years, I mentioned before, your household name for many different things, but there was also a moment there where people were begging you to put your hand up for Liberal Party leadership after the fall of Scott Morrison. At least that's what the papers suggested was happening. Could you ever? I mean, you're local. We've just spent 40 minutes talking about how everything you do is for your local community and the younger generations and everything like that. Could you ever see yourself ascending to leadership? Do you have aspirations to do that?
I don't think we have some sort of designated survivor situation here in in Australia, but I reckon that'd be the only way that that might happen for me.
Right. Yeah.
It would be the Kiefer Sutherland of Australian politics.
You just need Parliament House to explode and you'll be out the back.
Possibly.
Yeah.
But actually, I'm okay with that. Of course I have the same sort of ambitions or aspirations as anyone else, but it's not what drives me or motivates me. And, I'm so proud to be the member for Bass and to represent the community of Bass. And every day I get to do that. I'm grateful for that. So, no, I mean, yeah, you wouldn't say no to it. Who is going to say, I'm not ambitious or I wouldn't like, to achieve things, personally? But it really isn't what drives me on.
Now, the Nikki Sava, journalist who's in and around Canberra a lot, wrote an interesting book in the wake of the Morrison losing the 2022 election to Albanese. It was titled Bulldozer, and it painted a pretty it didn't paint a very good image of the former Prime Minister. You were in it, you were featured in it, and as were many other MPs, a lot on the record, going on the record, speaking out against Morrison's conduct or the way he did things for the first time. Have things gotten better in the party, like in your opinion, compared to the back? Nikki Sava spoke about the woman problem in the Liberal Party at that time. It played a big part in them losing, in your party losing those blue ribbon seats to independents. Has that problem been resolved as far as you can see?
I certainly think it's been improved. And I think you alluded to this during, our chat today around even, I think, and other people have remarked to me personally that how I may have presented myself like 2 years ago to how I might present myself today is different. And that is a direct representation too of that. Like, I feel, that has been better for me personally, in the last few years. I have had, a better time negotiating some of these things and whatever, and have been treated differently in some ways than I was at that time, and I was sort of on the record about many of the problems at that time. And for me personally, yes, there has been, and I can't speak to, the wider issue or whatever. I of course do happen to be a woman. There is work to do. I don't think we should shy away from that. There's more work to be done in that area, but I think there has been a willingness to confront that issue and to, to sort of take steps to to address it. And we've seen that even yesterday, like with, the deputy leader and her, speaking intentionally to that issue, not shying away from it, but acknowledging that it that it did exist, that it still exists, but that there has been improvements, but there's more to do.
So just as we touched on at the top of the podcast, it's almost, as you said, like the last day of school there in Parliament House at the moment. An election is imminent, and of course there are winners and losers of every election, not just in Canberra but around the country. If Peter Dutton were to lead a coalition to victory, what would his Australia look like? What industries, what groups would be the winners and who would be the losers?
Well, I think he's been very clear himself about his views on that, including even today before we rise around people are being left behind, people are being forgotten right across the country, whether that's, mums and dads in our suburbs, mortgage holders, renters, people who can't get access to mortgages or rents, the cost of living, small businesses. Small businesses are, at the kind of heart of what we believe in as a party. And for me personally, coming from an electorate where we're a kind of an entrepreneurial electorate made up of many, many small and family businesses, that's a sector that's really doing tough. They need our support and our efforts. We need to be, Team Australia to a degree. We need to make sure that our sovereignty is protected, that our safety is upheld. All of those things are important. And as I said earlier, none of these are new themes. We need to make sure that people get access to the essential services that they need, like healthcare, in our communities. None of this is new. You would have heard it at every election, and I don't think it's going to change. But I think it's about people saying, well, we've given these guys an opportunity and with a lot of promise, I have to say. People are like, okay, this is going to be a new start. We're ruling a line under it. And I don't feel that that's what people feel that they have got. And I think they are looking back and saying, well, am I actually better off now than I was back then? And some of that has to be about, in my opinion, there's no doubt that the last election was something of a referendum on Scott Morrison as well. And I certainly felt that in my electorate. People would say all the time, I think you've done a good job, but really don't want Scott Morrison. You would hear it across the country. And so I think it was a bit of a reaction to that. And I think that, in part, the Prime Minister has got to have done better than I'm not that guy. And I think that's the test. Have you done better than just being I'm not that guy? And I don't think that, I think the jury's a bit out on that. And people are really looking for direction and leadership and wanting to know, well, are things going to get better soon? Soon, because we can't afford to keep kind of hanging on your promise of not being left behind eventually.
I know there's no real, there's a lot of things that you would want and a lot of parts, like ways to do your job. But if you had a magic wand, regardless of who wins this next election, what do you want? If you had a magic wand, what would you immediately change, within your mechanisms of power?
I think that's a really hard question because there's so many parts to that. But I think for me, a lot of that comes back to what do we come here to do? Yep. And going into an election, you hear a lot of talk, and you will, of course, hear talk on both sides about the policy positions of both sides. But I think people do need to take that back to their local level and take it back to their local representation too, because you don't know what the government is going to look like at the end of that. Is it a minority government? Is it a majority government? What colour is that government? But one thing that you can guarantee and that you have control over is who represents you at your local level and your access to them and your ability to influence what they do. And that's what people have control of. And it's the part that really excites me and has become a passion for me is that upholding of our democracy. And I want people to understand that they have power in this, and that I don't want people to say, it's politics, why would you matter? Doesn't matter who you vote for, whatever. It matters who you vote for in your patch, because that will determine when all of these big policies come to Canberra, which they inevitably will, whatever colour the government is, and that's what we've seen here in this parliament, can that be realised will depend on the voices that you send here, and what that means for your electorate will depend on the voices you send here to fight for you.
Well, it is almost exactly a year since you crossed the floor to urge the American and the British governments to bring Julian Assange back here. And today he's on a beach on the south coast of New South Wales. Does that make crossing the floor something that you feel strongly about about how you vote for how your electorate and you feel? Does that kind of galvanize you to see the results come to fruition?
It's heartening. It's heartening. And I think there's a whole range of views about Julian Assange, which I, spoke about at the time of that fight. And people are galvanised to fight that fight for lots of different reasons. For me, I think it ultimately came down to, irrespective of your kind of views on it, Australian citizen incarcerated overseas for a protracted amount of time, suffering both physically and mentally, his family suffering physically and mentally, with no sort of end in sight to that. I think it's pretty satisfying that there's, an Australian citizen returned home, spending time with his young family now, and, that's a pleasing outcome. But, I think it makes it's always worth it. It's always worth it to stand up for what you think is right. To have a line in the sand that you say that's a line for me. I'm not going to trade my values on that thing. And I think there's also, as I said, it is also important to recognise though that we none of us are an island, to go back to your islands as well. And we live in a society and a democracy, and none of our views are more, important than anyone else's. We do have to build consensus. That's why we come here, and we're never going to get everything we want. So it's important to have values and to have hills that you will die on. But you also have to recognise that you can't die on every one. And where are you prepared to build coalitions and consensuses to get the best outcome?
Bridget Archer, thank you for joining us. Again, following last week's guest, which was Queensland Greens Senator Larissa Waters, you've answered the questions. This is so refreshing to have the first two guests in this pre-election podcast series to answer questions and not dance around them. I find it inspiring for the years to come in Parliament House. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.